My stepson asked me to watch a movie, and we did more than that. Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, subscribe to my channel for more dramatic tales like this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. When my stepson leaned closer during the movie, his arm brushing lightly against mine, I realized the boundaries of our relationship had shifted. It wasn't intentional, or at least that's what I told myself at first. The darkness of the living room, illuminated only by the flicker of the television, felt like a cocoon. Time seemed to slow, and the air between us thickened with an unspoken tension I wasn't ready to confront. It started as an ordinary evening. My husband, as usual, had left early for a work trip. The predictability of his absence no longer fazed me. In fact, I had come to expect the solitude. But this time, solitude wasn't what I got. My stepson, Ethan, had stayed home instead of going out with his friends. "Hey, why don't we watch something together tonight?" he asked casually, his tall frame leaning against the kitchen doorway as I finished cleaning up dinner. His voice was nonchalant, but there was something in his eyes, warmth, maybe, that caught me off guard. "Sure," I said, trying to mask my surprise. "Any preferences?" "Whatever you want," he replied with a shrug. "Something nostalgic?" I nodded, smiling despite myself. Ethan was 23 now, home for a few weeks before heading back to graduate school. Over the years, our relationship had evolved from awkward small talk to a comfortable rhythm. He was thoughtful and funny, filling a void I hadn't realized was there. But tonight there was an unfamiliar weight in the way he looked at me, a quiet intensity that lingered long after he left the room. We settled on an old comedy we used to watch as a family, back when things felt simpler. He sprawled out on the couch, and I sat at the far end, curling my legs beneath me. The opening credits rolled, and for a while, everything felt normal. We laughed at the same jokes, shared the same memories, and for a brief moment, I forgot about the growing chasm in my marriage. But then, halfway through the movie, everything changed. It was subtle at first. Ethan shifted closer, his arm resting along the back of the couch. I didn't think much of it until I felt the brush of his fingertips against my shoulder. It was light, almost accidental, but it sent a shiver through me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Was it an accident? Should I move? "Cold?" he asked softly, his voice cutting through the silence. "No," I replied, too quickly. My cheeks flushed as I avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the screen. But I could feel him watching me, his eyes tracing my profile like a secret he wasn't sure he should keep. For the next few minutes, I tried to distract myself, but the awareness of his presence was all-consuming. His scent, a mix of soap and something faintly musky, lingered in the air, and I found myself acutely aware of every move he made. When he shifted again, this time leaning in to grab the remote, his knee brushed against mine. The contact was fleeting, but the heat of it stayed long after he pulled away. "You okay?" he asked, his tone careful. "Of course," I lied, forcing a smile. "Why wouldn't I be?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You just seem different tonight." "I'm fine," I insisted, though my voice wavered. "Really?" But I wasn't fine. I was unraveling, caught between the safety of denial and the dangerous thrill of what I couldn't bring myself to admit. This was Ethan, my stepson, the boy I'd helped raise. And yet, in this moment, he felt like something else entirely. Something forbidden. Something I shouldn't want. The movie played on, but neither of us was paying attention anymore. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier, as the space between us dissolved into something electric. I could feel it. This invisible pole that tethered us together, daring me to cross a line I'd never considered before. And then he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been lonely, haven't you?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. How could he know? How could he see through the carefully constructed facade I wore like armor every day? My lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, I turned to him, my eyes meeting his, and in that instant, everything I'd been holding back came rushing to the surface, emanating the sense of grief. Everything I'd been holding back came rushing to the surface. "Yes," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop it. "I have." His gaze softened, and he reached out, his hand hovering just above mine. "Me too," he said, his voice tinged with something that sounded like pain. "It's not the same without you. Without us." My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I wanted to pull away, to break the spell before it consumed me, but I couldn't. Instead, I stayed frozen, caught in the gravity of his confession. And when his hand finally closed over mine, I didn't stop him. We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, the weight of our unspoken feelings pressing down on us. It wasn't right. Nothing about this was right. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The world outside the living room faded away, leaving only the two of us and the fragile connection we were too afraid to name. When the credits finally rolled, Ethan broke the silence. "I should go to bed," he said, his voice thick with emotion. But he didn't move. Instead, he lingered, his fingers brushing against mine one last time before he stood. "Good night," I murmured, my throat tight. "Good night," he replied, his eyes holding mine for a beat longer than they should have. As he walked away, I let out a shaky breath, my mind racing with everything that had just happened, and everything that hadn't. The boundaries of our relationship had shifted, and there was no going back. What came next, I didn't know, but one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, the remnants of last night still heavy on my mind. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, the sunlight streaming through the window doing little to dispel the fog of guilt and confusion clouding my thoughts. I wasn't sure if Ethan would come downstairs or if he'd avoid me altogether. Part of me hoped for the latter, but another, darker part wanted to see him, to decipher the meaning behind the connection we'd shared. I didn't have to wait long. The sound of footsteps descending the stairs made my heart jump, and I quickly busied myself with rearranging the fruit bowl on the counter. "Morning," Ethan said as he walked in, his voice casual. If he was feeling the same turmoil I was, he didn't show it. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough." He grabbed a glass from the cupboard and filled it with water. "You?" I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "I didn't sleep much." He paused mid-sip, his eyes flicking to mine. For a moment, it felt like he was about to say something, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded and took another drink. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking, to address the unspoken tension lingering from the night before, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. How could I, when I wasn't even sure what I wanted to hear? Ethan broke the silence first. I was thinking of heading out for a bit later. Want me to grab anything while I'm out? It was such a normal question, so perfectly mundane, that it almost made me laugh. Here we were, navigating the aftermath of a moment that could destroy everything, and he was asking if I needed groceries. Raising my fingers, I started to chant, waiting for him to mark me. "No, I think we're good," I said, my voice steady for the first time that morning. "All right." He leaned against the counter, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "If you need anything, just let me know." I nodded, grateful for the excuse to turn away. "Thanks." He lingered for a moment longer before heading out, leaving me alone with my thoughts once again. I sank into the nearest chair, my hands trembling as I replayed our conversation in my mind. He seemed so composed, so unaffected, while I felt like I was unraveling at the seams. Was it possible that I'd imagined the connection between us? That I'd misinterpreted his intentions? But deep down, I knew better. The way he'd looked at me last night, the softness in his voice when he said he'd missed me, it wasn't my imagination, and that terrified me more than anything. Silently, I shuddered as I reached him, feeling something untethered move through me. The rest of the day passed in a blur of half-finished chores and restless pacing. I tried to distract myself, but no matter what I did, my thoughts kept circling back to Ethan. By the time evening rolled around, I was emotionally drained, and the last thing I wanted was another tense encounter. But when Ethan returned home, his demeanor was so normal, so effortlessly casual, that I started to doubt my own feelings. He greeted me with the same warm smile he always had, asked how my day was, and even offered to help with dinner. For a while, it almost felt like nothing had changed. We sat down to eat together, the clinking of silverware filling the silence between bursts of small talk. I found myself watching him more than I should have, studying the way his hands moved, the curve of his jaw when he laughed. It was wrong, I knew that, but the knowledge did nothing to quell the feeling stirring inside me. "Are you okay?" he asked suddenly, his brow furrowing. "Wait." I blinked, startled by the question. "You've seemed distracted lately," he said, his tone gentle. "Is everything all right?" "I'm fine," I said quickly, too quickly. The way his eyes narrowed told me he didn't believe me, but he didn't push the issue. Instead, he nodded and returned to his meal, leaving me to stew in my own discomfort. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, the TV playing quietly in the background. I couldn't focus on the show. I wasn't even sure what was on. My mind was too preoccupied with the feelings I'd been trying so desperately to suppress. How had I let things get this far? Ethan was my stepson, for God's sake. I'd helped raise him, watched him grow from an awkward teenager into the confident, capable man he was today. I should have been proud of him, grateful for the bond we shared. But instead I was sitting here, my heart racing at the thought of him, my body aching with a desire I didn't want to acknowledge. I buried my face in my hands, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me like a physical force. This couldn't happen. It wouldn't happen. I'd make sure of it. Tomorrow, I'd put some distance between us, set boundaries that couldn't be crossed. It was the only way to preserve what was left of my family, to protect us both from the consequences of our actions. But even as I made the resolution, a small, insistent voice in the back of my mind whispered that it might already be too late. The next few days were a careful balancing act. I went out of my way to avoid being alone with Ethan, filling my time with errands and chores that kept me busy and out of the house. When we did cross paths, I kept our interactions brief and impersonal, hoping he wouldn't notice the shift in my behavior. If he did, he didn't say anything. In fact, he seemed almost relieved by the change, as though he, too, was struggling to navigate the new dynamic between us. For a while, it seemed to work. The tension between us began to ease, and I started to believe that we could move past what had happened. But then, one evening, everything came crashing down. It was a quiet night, just the two of us in the house. I'd been in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when Ethan appeared in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, and his eyes focused on the Sheffields hanging from the ceiling. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice hesitant. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "About what?" "About us," he said simply, stepping into the room. "There is no us," I said, my voice trembling. "You're my stepson, Ethan. That's all there is to it." He shook his head, his eyes locking onto mine. "You don't believe that any more than I do." "Ethan, please." "No," he interrupted, his tone firm. "We need to talk about this. I can't keep pretending like nothing's changed. Can you?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was right. I couldn't keep pretending. But admitting that felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to face. "I don't know what to say," I whispered finally, my voice barely audible. "Then don't say anything," he said, his gaze softening. "Just listen." And so I did. Ethan stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking with every step. My instinct was to back away, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. His eyes, steady and full of an emotion I couldn't quite name, bore into mine, and I found myself unable to look away. "I know this isn't easy for you," he began, his voice low but steady. "It's not easy for me either. But I can't pretend like last night didn't happen. I can't pretend that I don't feel something." His words hit me like a wave, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I'd spent the last few days convincing myself that what had happened was a fluke, an anomaly born of loneliness and proximity. But hearing him say it out loud, acknowledging the tension I'd been desperately trying to ignore, made it impossible to deny. "Ethan," I said, my voice trembling, we can't." "I know," he interrupted, his tone softening. "I know how complicated this is. I know how wrong it might seem. But don't tell me you don't feel it too." And as I smiled, he lit a candle and placed it perpendicularly beneath the knees of my bed. I wanted to argue, to push him away and end this conversation before it spiraled out of control, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, my heart pounding, as the silence between us stretched on. "I see it in the way you look at me," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The way you hesitate when I get close. It's not just me, is it?" I swallowed hard, my throat tightening with emotion. "It doesn't matter," I said finally. "Whatever this is, it has to stop. We can't." "Why not?" he asked, his tone more forceful now. "Why can't we talk about this? Why can't we be honest about how we feel?" "Because it's wrong." The words burst out of me before I could stop them, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "You're my stepson, Ethan. This, whatever this is, it's not right." He flinched at my words, but his gaze didn't waver. "I'm not a kid anymore," he said quietly. "I'm not your son." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. I knew what he meant, and I hated how much the truth of it resonated with me. He wasn't a child anymore. He was a grown man, capable of making his own choices. But that didn't change the fact that I was his stepmother, and this, whatever was happening between us, was a line that couldn't be crossed. "I can't do this," I said, shaking my head. "I can't risk everything we've built, everything I've built with your father. It's not fair to him. It's not fair to you." "Fair?" he echoed, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You think this is about fairness? Do you think I wanted to feel this way? Do you think I wanted to fall for someone I can't have?" His words sent a jolt through me, and I stared at him, stunned into silence. I'd suspected his feelings ran deeper than they should, but hearing him say it out loud made it all too real. "Ethan, please," I said, my voice breaking. "You don't mean that. You're just confused. This is... I'm not confused," he said firmly, cutting me off. "I know exactly how I feel, and I know you feel it too." The raw honesty in his voice left me reeling, and I turned away, unable to meet his gaze. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, fear, longing, all tangled together in a knot I couldn't untangle. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, to deny the feelings he'd accused me of having, but I couldn't, because deep down, I knew he was right. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and awkwardness. Ethan and I tiptoed around each other, our interactions strained and filled with an unspoken tension that neither of us dared to acknowledge. I threw myself into mundane tasks, scrubbing floors that didn't need cleaning and organizing cabinets I hadn't opened in years. Anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memories of our conversation or the feelings it had unearthed. Ethan, for his part, seemed equally unsettled. He spent most of his time out of the house, returning late in the evening with vague explanations about where he'd been. When we did cross paths, he was polite but distant, his usual warmth replaced by a guardedness that made my heart ache. It wasn't until the following weekend that everything came to a head. I was in the living room folding laundry when Ethan walked in. He hesitated in the doorway, his expression uncertain. "Can I sit?" he asked. I nodded, my throat tightening as he sank into the armchair across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. Belly pushed back my blankets, his round face resting against mine. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice soft but steady, "about what you said." I looked up, my hand stilling on the shirt I was folding. And I get it," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I get why you're scared, why you think this is wrong. But I can't just turn off how I feel. I can't pretend like this doesn't matter." I swallowed hard, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "Ethan, I'm not asking you to pretend. I need time. I need space to figure this out." He nodded slowly, his eyes finally meeting mine. "I can give you that he said. But I need to know, is there a chance for us? The question hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I don't know, I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to do. All I know is that this isn't simple. And no, he said with a faint smile, it's not. But that doesn't mean it's not worth it. His words lingered in the air long after he'd left the room, leaving me alone with the weight of my uncertainty. The next morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach, the weight of Ethan's words still heavy on my mind. I couldn't avoid him forever, but the idea of facing him, of facing the truth, felt impossible. I tried to focus on the day ahead, burying myself in tasks and errands that kept me out of the house as much as possible. When I returned later that afternoon, the house was quiet, almost too quiet. I placed the grocery bags on the counter, my ears straining for any sign of Ethan. Part of me was relieved that he wasn't around, but another part, a part I wasn't proud of, felt an undeniable pang of disappointment. I was halfway through putting away the groceries when I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps behind me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I turned to find Ethan standing in the doorway, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jeans. "Hey," he said, his voice tentative. "Hey," I replied, forcing a smile. "I didn't hear you come in." "I've been here all day," he said, stepping into the kitchen. "Just upstairs." "Oh," I said, my hands fumbling with the carton of eggs. I placed it in the fridge and closed the door, trying to steady my breathing. He lingered by the counter, his gaze fixed on me. "We need to talk." My stomach churned. "Ethan, I don't think—" "Please," he said, cutting me off. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending like everything's fine when it's not." I sighed, leaning against the counter. "What do you want me to say?" "Anything," he said, his voice cracking. "Just tell me how you feel. Tell me the truth." I hesitated, my mind racing. I wanted to tell him what he wanted to hear, to give him the answers he was searching for. But the truth was, I didn't know how I felt. Or maybe I did, and I was just too scared to admit it. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I feel, Ethan. All I know is that this, whatever this is, it's dangerous, and it's not fair to either of us." "Fair?" he said, his tone bitter. "Since when has life ever been fair? Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I wanted to fall for you?" The raw emotion in his voice left me speechless. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I know it's complicated," he continued, stepping closer. "I know there are a million reasons why this shouldn't happen, but none of that changes how I feel. And I don't think it changes how you feel either." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan, just tell me," he said, his voice softening. "Do you feel anything for me? Anything at all?" The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded, a single tear slipping down my cheek. His eyes softened, and he reached out, brushing the tear away with his thumb. "That's all I needed to know," he said, quietly. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and tense silences. I avoided Ethan as much as I could, but our shared space made it impossible to keep my distance entirely. Every time our paths crossed, I felt the weight of his gaze, the unspoken words hanging between us like a storm cloud. One evening, as I sat in the living room with a glass of wine, Ethan appeared in the doorway. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. When he saw me standing there, his eyes lingered for a moment. "Can I sit?" he asked. I nodded, my throat tightening as he sank into the armchair across from me. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice soft but steady, "about us, about what this means." I set my glass down, my hands trembling slightly. And I think we need to figure this out," he said, leaning forward, "together." "Then we can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, his gaze steady. "Why can't we at least talk about this? Why can't we figure out what this is before we decide it's impossible?" "Because it is impossible," I said, my voice trembling. "You're my stepson, Ethan. This, whatever this is, it's wrong." "Is it?" he asked, his tone challenging. "Or are we just too scared to face the truth?" I looked away, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know that we can't keep going like this. It's not fair to either of us. Neither of us wanted for this." "Then let's figure it out," he said, his voice softening. "Let's talk about it. Let's be honest with each other." I hesitated, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to shut the conversation down, to put an end to the tension once and for all. But another part, a part I wasn't ready to confront, wanted to hear him out. "Okay," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's talk." We sat together for hours, unraveling the tangled web of emotions that had been building between us. He spoke openly about his feelings, about the connection he felt, and the loneliness that had driven him to seek comfort in me. And for the first time, I allowed myself to be vulnerable, admitting the cracks in my marriage and the deep-seated yearning for something more. By the time the conversation ended, the tension between us had shifted. It was still there, still heavy and complicated, but there was also a sense of understanding, a fragile truce that neither of us dared to break. As Ethan stood to leave, he paused, his gaze meeting mine. "Thank you," he said softly, "for being honest." I felt his hand take mine. I nodded, my throat tight. "You too." And he hesitated for a moment longer before turning and walking away, leaving me alone with the weight of everything we'd just shared. The fragile peace we'd established didn't last long. The next morning, Ethan's father, my husband, called to say he'd be coming home early from his trip. The news sent a jolt of panic through me, and I spent the rest of the day on edge, hyper-aware of the thin ice we were standing on. When my husband finally arrived that evening, Ethan and I were in the kitchen, making dinner. The sound of the front door opening sent my heart racing, and I forced a smile as my husband walked in. "Hey, honey," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "Missed you." "You too," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He turned to Ethan, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good to see you, son. How's everything been?" "Good," Ethan said, his tone neutral. "Quiet." "Quiet's good," my husband said with a laugh. "God knows I could use a little quiet after this week." As the evening wore on, the tension in the house became almost unbearable. Every glance, every word felt loaded with hidden meaning, and I found myself counting the minutes until I could retreat to the sanctuary of my room. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew that this was only the beginning. The storm was far from over, and I had no idea how or if we would survive it. In other words, our survival would now depend on our resilience. The next few days were a tense balancing act. With my husband home, the delicate truth between Ethan and me felt like a thread stretched too thin, ready to snap at any moment. I did everything in my power to avoid being alone with Ethan, terrified that even the smallest slip would expose the truth. But avoiding him wasn't easy, especially with my husband obliviously throwing us together at every opportunity. "Ethan, why don't you help your stepmom with the groceries?" my husband suggested one afternoon, lounging on the couch with a beer. "I'll finish up this show and get dinner started." I froze, my hands gripping the grocery bags tighter than necessary. "I'm fine," I said quickly. "I don't need help." "Nonsense," my husband said, waving me off. "Go on, Ethan. Be useful." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded, taking the bags from my hands and following me into the kitchen. The moment the door swung shut behind us, the tension in the air became suffocating. Neither of us spoke as we unpacked the groceries, the silence broken only by the rustle of bags and the clink of jars against the counter. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked finally, his voice low. "I'm fine," I said, avoiding his gaze. "Just trying to keep everything normal." "Normal," he repeated, a hint of bitterness in his tone. "Is that what we're calling this?" No. I turned to him, my chest tightening. "Ethan, please, don't do this. Not here, not now." He stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to keep pretending, you know. Not with me." "I'm not pretending," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. "I'm just trying to keep things from falling apart." "And what about you?" he asked, stepping closer. "What about what you want?" His question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. I opened my mouth to respond, but the sound of footsteps approaching the kitchen stopped me cold. Ethan stepped back, his expression hardening just as my husband walked in. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, glancing between us. "Fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just putting things away." He nodded, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension between us. "Good. Dinner's almost ready." I watched him leave, my heart pounding as I turned back to Ethan. His expression was guarded, his eyes flicking toward the door before landing back on me. "This isn't sustainable," he said quietly. "You know that, right?" I didn't respond. Instead, I turned back to the groceries, focusing on the mundane task in front of me and ignoring the storm brewing in my chest. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as my husband snored softly beside me. My mind was a chaotic mess, filled with guilt, fear, and something far more dangerous: longing. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. His words, his touch, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. I hated myself for it. I hated the way my heart raced whenever he was near, the way my thoughts strayed to him even when I tried to push them away. But most of all, I hated the part of me that didn't want to stop. I began to paint my toes, softening my skin. I sat up, the weight of my thoughts too heavy to bear. Careful not to wake my husband, I slipped out of bed and padded down the hall to the kitchen. I needed air, space to think, something to quiet the turmoil in my mind. But when I stepped into the living room, I wasn't alone. Ethan was there, sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. He looked up as I entered, his eyes meeting mine in the dim light. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. No, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. You? He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. Not much these days. I hesitated, torn between the urge to leave and the pull to stay. Against my better judgment, I crossed the room and sat down across from him, the distance between us both too much and not enough. We need to stop, I said finally, my voice trembling. This, whatever this is, it has to stop. I know, he said, his gaze steady, but that doesn't mean it's going to. His honesty left me breathless, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The silence stretched between us, heavy and charged, until he broke it. Why are you so afraid? He asked, his tone gentle. What are you so scared of? I'm scared of ruining everything, I admitted, my voice breaking. I'm scared of losing my family, of losing you. You're not going to lose me, he said firmly, not unless you push me away. I looked at him, my heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. Ethan, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to feel. You don't have to figure it all out right now, he said, leaning forward. That you don't have to fight it, either. His words settled over me like a balm, easing the chaos in my mind just enough to let me breathe. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. Fragile and fleeting, but real. But then, as if on cue, the sound of a door creaking upstairs shattered the moment. We froze, our gazes snapping toward the hallway as the heavy thud of footsteps echoed down the stairs. Panic surged through me, and I shot to my feet, my heart racing as my husband appeared in the doorway. What are you two doing up? He asked, his voice groggy with sleep. Just... He nodded, rubbing his eyes. Well, try to get some rest. You both look exhausted. I nodded, avoiding his gaze as I backed toward the hallway. Good night. As I disappeared into the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not yet. The days following that late-night encounter were a blur of heightened awareness and suppressed emotions. Every interaction with Ethan felt like walking a tightrope. My husband, oblivious as ever, seemed completely unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we were teetering on the edge of something catastrophic. It was a Friday evening when the fragile facade finally cracked. My husband had gone out with his coworkers, leaving Ethan and me alone in the house. I told myself I'd stay in my room, keep my distance, but the quiet of the house was suffocating. I ended up downstairs in the kitchen, pacing as I sipped on a glass of wine, my nerves frayed. The sound of footsteps made me jump, and I turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jeans. You're tense, he said, his tone low but gentle. I laughed humorlessly, setting my glass down on the counter. That's an understatement. He stepped closer, his presence filling the room in a way that made it hard to breathe. We can't keep doing this, he said quietly. Doing what? I asked, though I already knew the answer. This, he said, gesturing between us. Tiptoeing around each other like strangers, pretending like nothing's happening when we both know it is. I turned away, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. Ethan, we've talked about this. It has to stop. Why? He asked, his voice rising slightly. Why does it have to stop? Because it's wrong? Or because you're scared? I whipped around, anger flaring in my chest. Yes, I'm scared. I'm terrified, Ethan, of what this means, of what we could lose. Then be scared, he said, his tone softening. But don't run away from it. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. The intensity in his gaze was overwhelming, and for a moment I couldn't move. I wanted to deny it, to push him away, but the truth was, I didn't want to run anymore. Ethan, I said, my voice trembling, this isn't just about us. There are other people involved, people who will get hurt. Ah, I know, he said, stepping closer. But what about you? Don't you deserve to be happy too? His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the tears welling up in my eyes. This isn't about happiness, I said, my voice breaking. This is about doing the right thing. And what if this is the right thing, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if we're meant to feel this way? I shook my head, the tears spilling over as I looked away. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know what's right anymore. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy with unspoken emotions. Then, slowly, Ethan reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me all the same. We don't have to have all the answers right now, he said softly. We just have to figure this out, together. I looked up at him, my heart aching with a mix of longing and fear. His eyes were steady, filled with a quiet determination that both terrified and comforted me. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The next morning, I woke with a sense of clarity that had eluded me for weeks. It wasn't a resolution, far from it, but it was a step forward, a decision to stop running from the truth. I couldn't undo what had already happened, but I could choose how to move forward. Ethan seemed to sense the shift in me. He was quieter than usual, his gaze lingering on me longer than it should have, but he didn't press the issue. It was as if he was waiting for me to make the first move, to decide what came next. That evening, as we sat in the living room watching TV, I turned to him, my heart pounding. We need to talk. Yeah. He muted the television, his eyes locking onto mine. Okay. I hesitated, my hands twisting nervously in my lap. I don't know what to do, I admitted. I don't know how to fix this. Maybe it doesn't need fixing, he said gently. Maybe it just needs understanding. I shook my head, frustration bubbling to the surface. This isn't normal, Ethan. This isn't how things are supposed to be. Who decides what's normal? He asked, his tone challenging. Who decides how things are supposed to be? I stared at him, my chest tightening as his words sank in. This isn't just about us, I said finally. There are consequences, Ethan, for both of us, for the family. I know, he said, his voice soft, but I also know that pretending like this doesn't exist isn't going to make it go away. I looked away, my mind racing with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. I need time, I said finally. Time to figure this out. You'll have it, he said, his voice steady. But I need you to be honest with yourself, with me. What do you mean? I nodded, my throat tightening. I will, I promise. As the credits rolled on the muted screen, we sat in silence, the weight of our conversation hanging heavy in the air. The path ahead was unclear, the choices daunting, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way through this, together. The next few days passed in a haze of quiet reflection. Ethan kept his distance, honoring my request for time, but his presence was still a constant undercurrent in my thoughts. My husband, oblivious as ever, carried on with his routines, none the wiser to the emotional storm brewing beneath the surface. I spent hours replaying our conversations, dissecting every word, every glance, every touch. The guilt was suffocating, but it was matched by something I couldn't ignore, a longing that refused to be silenced. I told myself it was just a phase, a reaction to the cracks in my marriage. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It wasn't just about Ethan. It was about the way he made me feel, seen, understood, alive. One evening, after my husband had gone to bed, I found myself wandering into the living room. The house was dark and quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I sank onto the couch, my mind a tangled mess of emotions I couldn't untangle. Couldn't sleep. I jumped at the sound of Ethan's voice, my heart racing as I turned to see him standing in the doorway. He looked hesitant, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jeans. "Now," I said softly, "I've got a lot on my mind." He stepped into the room, his movements careful, like he was afraid of breaking the fragile truce between us. "Want to talk about it?" As I was afraid of doing, I hesitated, my hands twisting in my lap. "I don't know where to start." "Start anywhere," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm here." His words sent a pang of emotion through me, and I looked away, my throat tightening. "I feel like I'm losing myself," I admitted, "like I don't know who I am anymore." "You're not losing yourself," he said, sitting down across from me. "You're just finding a part of yourself you've been ignoring." I shook my head, the tears welling up in my eyes. "It's not that simple, Ethan. There are so many things at stake, so many people who could get hurt." "I know," he said, his voice soft, "but you don't have to figure it all out tonight. You just have to take it one step at a time." I looked at him, my heart aching at the sincerity in his gaze. "I don't want to hurt anyone," I said, "especially not you." "You won't," he said firmly. "Not if we're honest with each other." His words settled over me like a balm, soothing the chaos in my mind just enough to let me breathe. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of clarity, a sense of direction in the overwhelming storm. "I don't know where this is going," I said finally. "I don't know if we'll ever figure it out, but I know I can't keep running from it." He nodded, his expression softening. "Neither can I." The days that followed were a careful balancing act. Ethan and I kept our distance when my husband was around. But in the quiet moments when it was just the two of us, we began to rebuild the fragile connection we'd nearly lost. It wasn't easy. Every step forward felt like walking on a tightrope, but for the first time, I felt like we were moving towards something real. One afternoon, while my husband was out running errands, Ethan found me in the garden, tending to the flower beds that had been neglected for far too long. He crouched beside me, his presence grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. "You're good at this," he said, gesturing to the neatly trimmed flowers. I smiled faintly, brushing the dirt from my hands. "It's therapeutic, helps me clear my head." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me. "You seem calmer." "I feel calmer," I admitted. "It's like the noise in my head isn't so loud anymore." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "That's good," he said softly. "You deserve peace." His touch sent a shiver through me, but this time I didn't pull away. Instead, I looked at him, my heart pounding as the weight of everything we'd been holding back settled between us. "Ah, Ethan," I said, my voice trembling. "This is—" "I know," he said, his gaze steady, "but that doesn't mean it's wrong." His words hung in the air, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The logical part of me wanted to argue, to push him away, but the part of me that had been yearning for connection, for understanding, wouldn't let me. "I don't know what's going to happen," I said finally, "but I do know that I can't do this alone." "Oh, you're not alone," he said firmly. "I'm here, no matter what." The sincerity in his voice left me breathless, and for the first time I allowed myself to believe it. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this, together. The quiet intimacy Ethan and I had built in the days since our conversation brought a strange sense of peace, but also a heavier awareness of the precariousness of our situation. Every word exchanged, every glance that lingered a moment too long, felt like a secret shared between us, one that threatened to unravel everything if exposed. After listening to the moments with Adrian and Alex updating us on the day's situation, I felt a higher level of emotional exhaustion. The storm finally came on a Sunday morning when my husband decided we should all go out for brunch as a family. I'd spent the entire night tossing and turning, dreading the forced closeness, the inevitable small talk, and the subtle tension Ethan and I couldn't quite hide. At the restaurant, my husband was in good spirits, joking with the server and reminiscing about family vacations from years ago. Ethan sat across from me, his eyes meeting mine briefly before flickering away. I tried to focus on the menu, but my appetite had vanished, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that made my hands tremble. "You okay, sweetheart?" my husband asked, his brow furrowing as he noticed my unease. "I'm fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just didn't sleep well." "Well, coffee should help with that," he said, signaling the server for a refill. "Ethan, how's school going? You still planning to finish your program by spring?" Ethan hesitated, his fork hovering over his plate. "That's the plan," he said finally, his tone neutral. "Good. We'll have to celebrate when you graduate. Maybe take a family trip somewhere warm. What do you think, honey?" "Sounds great," I said, my voice tight. I couldn't bring myself to look at Ethan, afraid that even the smallest glance would give me away. The tension between Ethan and me came to a head later that evening. My husband had gone to bed early, worn out from the day, leaving the two of us alone in the living room. The silence was suffocating, and I found myself pacing, my nerves frayed. "We can't keep doing this," I said finally, turning to face Ethan. This pretending, it's going to destroy us." "I know," he said, his voice steady. "But what do you want me to do? Walk away? Pretend like this doesn't matter?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." He stood, crossing the room in a few long strides until he was standing in front of me. "Then stop trying to figure it out alone," he said softly. "Let me help." His words broke something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I reached for him, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "I'm scared," I whispered. "I don't want to lose everything." He sighed. "You won't," he said firmly, his hands resting gently on my arms. "We'll figure this out. Together." His touch sent a shiver through me, and for a moment I let myself lean into him, the weight of my fear and guilt momentarily lifted. But the sound of a floorboard creaking upstairs snapped me back to reality, and I pulled away, my heart racing. "This can't happen," I said, my voice trembling. Not here. Not like this. He nodded, his expression pained. I understand. The next morning, I woke up early, the events of the previous night still heavy on my mind. My husband was already in the kitchen, sipping his coffee and reading the newspaper, completely unaware of the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. "Morning," he said, glancing up as I walked in. "You sleep okay?" "Better," I lied, forcing a smile. "What's on your agenda today?" "Just some errands," he said, folding the paper. "I'll be back by dinner." I nodded, my chest tightening as he kissed me on the cheek and headed out the door. As soon as he was gone, I sank into a chair, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. Ethan appeared a few minutes later, his hair disheveled and his expression guarded. "He's gone?" "For now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, leaning against the doorframe. "We need to talk." I nodded, motioning for him to sit. He crossed the room and sat across from me, his gaze steady. "I can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "The lying, the hiding, it's tearing me apart." The voice cut off. "I know," he said softly, "but what do you want to do?" "I don't know," I admitted, my eyes filling with tears. Part of me wants to stop, to walk away and pretend like nothing ever happened. But another part... My voice broke, and I looked away, ashamed. "Another part doesn't want to let go," he finished, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak. He reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. "You don't have to decide right now," he said gently, "but whatever you choose, I'll respect it. I need you to be honest with me, with yourself." I looked at him, my chest tightening at the sincerity in his gaze. "I don't want to lose you," I said finally, my voice breaking. "But I don't know how to keep you either." "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady. "Together." The final confrontation came one evening, weeks after that quiet morning in the kitchen. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long finally reached its boiling point, spilling over in a way neither Ethan nor I could have predicted. My husband had left for another business trip, giving Ethan and me the space we both feared and craved. I tried to stay busy, throwing myself into cleaning and errands, but the house felt too quiet, too heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Ethan kept his distance, but his presence lingered like a shadow, impossible to ignore. That night, I sat alone in the living room, a book in my lap that I hadn't read a single word of. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating, until the soft creak of footsteps broke through the quiet. I looked up to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady. I closed the book, my hands trembling as I set it aside. "About what?" "About us," he said, stepping into the room. "About what we're doing. Where this is going." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan, I don't know if..." "Stop," he said, cutting me off. His tone wasn't harsh, but it was firm, leaving no room for argument. "We can't keep dancing around this. You can't keep running from it." "I'm not running," I said, though the words felt like a lie even as I spoke them. "I'm trying to protect what we have, what I have." "And what about what we have?" he asked, his voice softening. "Does that not matter?" I looked away, my throat tightening. "Of course it matters. But it's not just about us, Ethan. It's about your father. It's about this family." "I know," he said, stepping closer. But pretending like this doesn't exist isn't protecting anyone. It's just hurting us. His words cut through me, raw and unfiltered, leaving me exposed. I couldn't deny the truth of what he was saying, but I also couldn't bring myself to accept it. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to be honest," he said simply, "with me, with yourself." I stood, the weight of his gaze too much to bear. "I don't know how to be," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know what's right anymore." Ethan stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "Hmm? Then let's figure it out together." His touch sent a shiver through me, and for a moment I let myself lean into it, into him. But the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment, and I pulled back, panic surging through me. "He's home," I whispered, my heart racing. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he stepped back, his eyes never leaving mine. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Not yet." My husband walked through the door moments later, his usual easygoing demeanor masking the storm brewing inside me. I forced a smile, greeting him with a kiss that felt hollow, my mind still reeling from my conversation with Ethan. As I returned to my chair, Spirit stood behind me, his gaze as steady as the uncertainty of my past 3 days through me. "Everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing as he studied me. "Of course," I said quickly, turning away before he could see the cracks in my facade. "Just tired." He nodded, setting his bag down by the door. "Long trip. I'm going to take a shower." As he disappeared up the stairs, I sank onto the couch, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. Ethan was right. This wasn't over. But I didn't know how to move forward without destroying everything in the process. The following morning, the house was quiet again. My husband had left early for a meeting, leaving Ethan and me alone once more. I found him in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee, as he stared out the window. "Morning," I said, my voice tentative. "Morning," he replied without looking at me. I hesitated, my hands twisting nervously. "About last night?" "You don't have to explain," he said, cutting me off. "I get it. You're scared. We can meet." "I am," I admitted, stepping closer, "but that doesn't mean I don't care." He turned to me, his gaze steady. "Then what does it mean?" "It means I need time," I said softly. "To figure this out? To figure us out?" His expression softened and he nodded. "Take all the time you need," he said. "Just don't shut me out." "I won't," I promised, my voice trembling. "I swear." As the weeks turned into months, the tension between Ethan and me began to ease. We found a new rhythm, one built on quiet understanding and cautious hope. It wasn't easy. Every glance, every touch still carried the weight of unspoken feelings. But it was a start. My husband remained oblivious, his focus on work leaving little room for suspicion. I told myself I was protecting him, protecting our family, but deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't ready to let go of him, of Ethan, of the fragile balance we'd created. In the end, there were no easy answers, no clean resolutions. The line between right and wrong blurred until it was impossible to distinguish one from the other. But as I stood in the garden one sunny afternoon, Ethan by my side, I felt a strange sense of peace. And it wasn't perfect, it wasn't simple, but it was ours. And for now, that was enough. The decision to leave felt impossible at first. The thought of walking away from the life I had built, the man I had married, and the family I had tried so hard to nurture was overwhelming. But in the quiet moments, when I sat alone and examined the fractured pieces of my life, I realized that staying meant living a lie, not just with my husband, but with myself. Ethan had left for graduate school a few weeks earlier, the house quieter than it had ever been. My husband, oblivious to the turmoil that had been brewing for months, resumed his routines as though nothing had changed. But for me, everything was different. I couldn't unsee the truth of my unhappiness. I couldn't ignore the way my heart had come alive when Ethan showed me a version of myself I had long buried. A woman who wanted more, who deserved more. One evening, after another stilted dinner conversation, I found myself sitting in the guest bedroom. This was where I kept the old photo albums, the ones filled with memories of a life that felt so distant now. I flipped through them, seeing my younger self smiling beside my husband, holding Ethan when he was still a boy. I had been so full of hope back then, so sure that love and family were all I needed to feel complete. But life had a way of wearing down those illusions. My husband's distance, his focus on work, had slowly chipped away at the foundation of our marriage. I had ignored it for years, telling myself it was normal, that every marriage had its ebbs and flows. But now, as I looked at those photos, I saw the cracks that had always been there, and I knew I couldn't stay. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of clarity that felt foreign but welcome. My husband had left early for a business meeting, and I had the house to myself. I walked through the rooms, touching the walls and furniture, saying silent goodbyes to a place that had been both a sanctuary and a prison. I made a list, something concrete to focus on as my emotions threatened to overwhelm me. By the time my husband returned that evening, I had made up my mind. I waited until after dinner, when the dishes were put away and the house had settled into its usual quiet. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He looked up from his laptop, his brow furrowing. "What's wrong?" I hesitated, my hands trembling. "I'm not happy," I said finally. "I haven't been for a long time." His expression shifted, a mix of confusion and concern. "What do you mean? Is this about work? About the house? What's going on?" "It's about us," I said, my voice breaking. "About the distance between us, the way we've been living like strangers under the same roof." "Make a vision board," I said. He stared at me, his face pale. "I didn't know you felt this way." "I've tried to ignore it," I admitted. "I've tried to convince myself that it didn't matter, that it was just part of being married. But it does matter, and I can't keep pretending anymore." For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze dropping to the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Is there someone else?" "Jokwe." The question hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't flinch. "No," I said truthfully. "This isn't about anyone else. This is about me, about what I need to feel whole again." He nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. "I don't want to lose you." "I don't want to hurt you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "But staying like this will only make it worse," I said. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of my words settling over us like a heavy fog. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. "Do what you need to do," he said quietly, "but know that I love you." The days that followed were a whirlwind of logistics and emotion. I moved into a small apartment across town, taking only what I needed and leaving the rest behind. It wasn't much, just a few suitcases and a handful of mementos, but it felt like shedding an old skin, letting go of a life that no longer fit. Ethan called a few weeks later, his voice hesitant on the other end of the line. "I heard about the divorce," he said. "Are you okay?" "I'm getting there," I said, smiling despite the lump in my throat. "It's hard, but it feels right." There was a pause, and I could hear the emotion in his voice when he spoke again. "I'm proud of you." His words brought tears to my eyes, but this time they were tears of relief, of gratitude. "Thank you," I said softly. "That means a lot." Over the months that followed, I began to rebuild my life. I found a job at a local nonprofit, pouring my energy into something that felt meaningful. I made new friends, joined a book club, and even started painting again, a hobby I hadn't touched in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for myself, not for anyone else. Every day, my fellow classmates moved on and found other people to fill their life. Ethan and I kept in touch, our conversations growing less frequent but no less meaningful. He was thriving in graduate school, making new friends and chasing his dreams. There was a sense of closure in our relationship, an understanding that what we had shared was important but not meant to last. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of my apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The road to this moment had been painful, filled with heartbreak and uncertainty, but it had also been transformative. I had found myself again, rediscovered the parts of me that had been buried under years of compromise and neglect. And for the first time, I felt ready to move forward. Not as a wife, not as a stepmother, but as the woman I was always meant to be.